When did a legal loophole, unexpected karma, or workplace drama completely backfire? Story 1. A few years ago, I worked at a small, family-owned restaurant. The owner's son, let's call him Mike, had recently taken over the business after his father retired. Mike was not exactly a people person. He was more concerned with cutting corners than actually managing the business. One of his schemes was to underreport tips, claiming that employees were tipping out less than they actually were, thus saving the business on taxes. I didn't realize this was happening at first, but once I found out, I was furious. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I started keeping a secret log of every single tip I received, down to the penny. Several months passed, and I began to notice something strange. Mike was becoming more paranoid about everything. He would hover around the staff, asking us strange questions, checking the registers, and even asking to see our personal tips logs. I knew something was coming. Eventually, during an audit, the restaurant was hit with a massive tax penalty for underreporting tip income. It turned out Mike had been cooking the books, and he didn't realize that some of us had been keeping detailed records. The audit revealed discrepancies, and not only did the business have to pay a huge fine, but Mike also got personally implicated in the fraud. The owner's son's clever loophole had completely backfired, and he lost his job as a result. Story 2. A few years ago, I worked as a project manager at a tech company. One of our clients had a long-standing agreement where they were required to pay us monthly, but there was a clause in the contract that allowed them to delay payments for up to 3 months if they were unhappy with our work. The client, known for being very picky, began invoking this clause every few months, despite the fact that our team was consistently delivering top-quality work. The delay in payments caused a major cash flow problem for us, and it felt like we were constantly chasing them for money. In an attempt to stop this, I took a more aggressive approach. I flagged every single issue I could find in their projects and started using the contract clause against them. Since the client had such an extensive network of freelancers they worked with, I started pointing out every minor mistake they made, even if it was their freelancer's fault. I made it clear that if they wanted their projects to keep running smoothly, they would need to resolve these issues immediately or face project delays. It turns out, this strategy completely backfired. Instead of getting a quick payment, the client fired us and started working with another company, one that was more forgiving of their sloppy practices. That contract clause was their loophole, but by trying to exploit it, we ended up with nothing but a lawsuit on our hands for interfering with their business relationships. Not only did we lose the client, but the lawsuit cost us far more than the delayed payments ever would have. In hindsight, we were better off just sticking to the original deal. Story 3. A few years ago, my friend was working at a large corporation where a fellow employee, Brian, was notorious for being lazy and finding ways to avoid doing any real work. Brian figured out that his department had an absurd policy that allowed employees to bank unused sick days for future leave. The loophole? He could convert his sick days into compensation days, which could be paid out in cash once he had accumulated enough. So, he would take sick days whenever possible, even when he wasn't sick, just to cash out later. At first, he seemed to be getting away with it, and his colleagues began to notice his clever little trick. However, Brian didn't count on the HR department catching wind of the situation. The company underwent a major restructuring, and as part of the changes, HR decided to conduct a full audit of employee leave balances. After a deep dive into his records, it became clear that Brian had taken sick days unnecessarily, and it violated company policy. When the audit was completed, Brian was hit with the consequences. Not only did he lose the cash payout, but he was also reprimanded for abusing the system. He ended up getting demoted and forced to pay back a significant portion of the money he had pocketed. The loophole he had thought he could exploit ultimately cost him his position and reputation at the company. In the end, it turned out that his attempt to take advantage of the system was the thing that completely backfired. Story 4. Years ago, I worked at a car rental place, and one of the employees, Tina, discovered a small but potentially lucrative loophole in our company's policy regarding late returns. If a customer returned a car late, they were usually charged a late fee. However, if the customer claimed to be unaware of the late return policy, the employee could waive the fee, as long as they documented the customer's innocent mistake. Well, Tina got a little too comfortable with this rule. Over time, she began waiving late fees for regular customers who came back a few hours late. Then, she started doing it for almost every late return, saying things like, "Oh, don't worry about it, we can just fix the system error." But what she didn't realize was that management was already suspicious of the rising number of waived fees. One day, Tina was called into the manager's office, where they had gathered a list of the hundreds of late fees she'd written off. It turned out Tina had been waiving the fees not just for friends or regulars, but for customers she had never met before. She was taking a cut of the money from each waived fee. When management confronted her, she tried to act surprised, but they had already done their homework. She was fired on the spot, and the company even filed charges for embezzlement. Tina thought she'd found a way to make some easy extra cash, but the loophole ultimately led to her getting caught and losing her job. Story 5. I once worked at a law firm where a senior associate, Laura, had a somewhat strange relationship with the firm's policies. Laura figured out a legal loophole in the way vacation days were accrued. You see, our firm had a policy that employees could take paid vacation days after 6 months of employment, but they also allowed vacation days to roll over, if not used within the year. Laura, being incredibly ambitious, figured out that if she spread her vacation days out over the course of the year, she could stack up enough days to take multiple extended vacations without anyone noticing. The problem? While she was away, other employees had to pick up the slack. And while Laura was great at delegating, she wasn't exactly a team player. Over time, resentment began to build as her coworkers became frustrated with her constant absences. It wasn't long before one of the partners caught wind of her clever manipulation of the system. They had been receiving complaints about her work ethic and noticed the pattern of absenteeism. Rather than giving her a warning or a slap on the wrist, the partners decided to fire her for poor team collaboration and a lack of commitment. In the end, Laura's clever loophole caused more harm than good, and she lost both her job and her reputation. She thought she had outsmarted the system, but it ended up biting her in the end. Story 6. I used to work at a large retail chain, and one of the managers, Kara, was obsessed with hitting sales targets. The company had a program where managers received bonuses based on how many items were sold, but the key was that they had to make sure the items were returned within a specific window to count as final sales. However, the loophole Kara found was that returns could be delayed if the product was deemed defective or damaged. What she started doing was convincing customers to take advantage of a return extension under the guise that their items were defective, even though they were perfectly fine. By doing this, the sales counted toward her monthly targets, but she still got the extended return window to hit her numbers. At first, everything seemed fine, and Kara was lauded for her performance. But as time passed, the higher-ups started noticing an unusual spike in returns and a growing number of complaints about defective products. A thorough internal audit revealed that many of the returns were due to her pushing a defective item narrative. The company then tracked these items down and realized they had been resold in pristine condition multiple times. Kara was caught manipulating the system for bonuses and let go instantly. Worse yet, the audit revealed she had been falsifying the condition of returned goods for months, leading to several legal investigations into the company's practices. Kara's ambition to reach targets turned into a nightmare for her career, and the company ended up overhauling its return policies and making several leadership changes. Story 7. A few years ago, I was working for a large, highly competitive marketing firm. Our CEO, a hard-nosed, profit-driven individual, had a strict rule about how we spent our time during office hours. We were required to clock in at 9 a.m. sharp, but there was no clocking out at 5 p.m. Everyone had to stay until the CEO left. Over time, this created an unhealthy work culture. People were regularly staying late, not because they were productive, but because they feared repercussions if they left earlier. Eventually, some of the more ambitious employees started working this to their advantage. One employee, Chris, realized that the CEO often left the office late, after most people had left. So, Chris began scheduling personal meetings during the workday, taking long lunch breaks and heading home early, claiming that he was handling urgent personal matters. He would sneak back into the office after hours and send out fake emails to make it appear as though he was still working. For months, Chris had been racking up personal hours under the guise of working overtime. No one caught on because, after all, everyone was working late to please the CEO. But eventually, a routine audit uncovered inconsistencies with Chris's work hours. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that Chris had been billing the company for time he never actually worked. The company immediately launched an internal probe, and Chris was confronted. Instead of taking responsibility, he attempted to defend his actions by claiming it was a miscommunication. The CEO, who had built a reputation on punishing dishonesty, fired him on the spot. In the end, not only did Chris lose his job, but his attempt to avoid working hard by manipulating the system led to a complete breakdown of trust in the office. Employees became more aware of the need to balance work and personal time, and the company even implemented stricter measures to track employee hours. Story 8. About 5 years ago, I was employed at a tech startup that was growing rapidly. One of the perks was that employees were allowed to expense meals for work-related meetings. The policy had an obvious loophole. It didn't specifically state what work-related meant, so some of the employees, especially the ones in higher positions, began to push the boundaries. One employee, Nick, decided to exploit this ambiguity. He began using the company's expense policy to charge every single meal, including his morning coffee and random fast food purchases, to the company account. His rationale was simple. He worked long hours and deserved to be reimbursed for his food, even if it wasn't technically a business expense. At first, the accounting department didn't bat an eye. After all, who would have thought to scrutinize someone's daily meals when it seemed like it could be related to work? But as time passed, the finance team noticed a pattern. Nick's expenses were incredibly high for someone who wasn't traveling for business or meeting clients. A quick audit of his charges revealed an extensive list of meals that weren't connected to work-related activities at all. When confronted, Nick attempted to justify the charges, claiming that the food was fuel for his productivity. However, the company's upper management wasn't impressed. They immediately fired him for abusing the system, and the company even decided to tighten its policy on expensing meals to prevent future abuses. Nick's attempt to exploit a loophole for personal gain cost him not only his job but also his professional reputation. It became a cautionary tale of why pushing boundaries too far can result in a major downfall. Story 8. I was working in a small law firm, and one of our attorneys, Sophia, was a whiz at finding technicalities in the law. She discovered that if she filed motions for lack of evidence, even when the case was relatively strong, she could buy herself more time. She quickly realized that many of the cases she was working on had deadlines that, if extended, would result in extra fees for the client. Essentially, she was using every minor piece of information, even if it didn't affect the case, to create the illusion of needing more time. At first, this tactic worked. Her clients were satisfied because it bought them more breathing room, and the extra fees accumulated. But Sophia didn't realize that her manipulations were making other team members uncomfortable, especially the more seasoned lawyers. When one of the senior partners caught wind of the strategy, they became suspicious and began to dig deeper. An internal audit revealed that Sophia had been strategically prolonging cases without providing any substantial legal reasoning, essentially dragging things out for financial gain. When she was confronted, she initially denied everything. But the evidence was clear. She had been exploiting the legal system for extra money. Sophia was fired immediately for unethical behavior, and her actions led the firm to introduce new checks and balances in the way cases were managed. While she thought she could outsmart the system for a quick payday, it ended up costing her her entire career. Story 10. Years ago, I worked for a large e-commerce company. We had a rewards program where customers would receive points for every purchase, which could later be redeemed for discounts or free products. The company's system had an interesting loophole that allowed customers to receive points for canceled transactions. One of the employees, Jason, found out that if he purchased an item and then immediately canceled it, he still received the points for the transaction. Over time, he began to exploit this by purchasing and canceling hundreds of small-ticket items just to rack up points. At first, Jason thought he was being clever. He would accumulate hundreds of dollars worth of rewards without spending much money at all. However, his activities didn't go unnoticed. One day, the IT department flagged an unusually high number of canceled transactions under Jason's account. An investigation revealed that he had been gaming the system for months, and it turned out he wasn't the only one. Several other employees had caught onto the loophole and were doing the same thing. Rather than firing Jason and the others immediately, the company decided to take a more subtle approach. They let them continue with the activity for a while. And once they had all accumulated a significant amount of rewards points, the company then deactivated their accounts and revoked all the points. Jason and the others were left with nothing but canceled orders and no access to their rewards, effectively nullifying their actions. The company also implemented new systems to prevent similar exploits. Jason learned the hard way that trying to cheat the system for personal gain may give you an edge in the short term, but it'll backfire when you least expect it. Story 11. Several years ago, I was working in a small sales department at a mid-sized company. We had a commission-based pay structure where salespeople earned a percentage of their sales. The catch was that the higher-ups had a strict policy about returns. If a customer returned an item, the salesperson who made the sale would lose their commission for that product. One of my colleagues, Jess, discovered a loophole in the system. She realized that if she pushed customers to buy more expensive items and convinced them to cancel the order after receiving it, the return policy would kick in, and the company would still process the return as a valid transaction. Jess wasn't the most ethical salesperson, But she convinced herself that it was just part of the business world. By convincing customers to return their purchases under the guise of buying the wrong thing, or just didn't like it, she would pocket the commission from the initial sale and then get the product back. Essentially, she was double-dipping, earning the commission without losing the item. At first, Jess's strategy seemed foolproof. She was making sales left and right and bringing in extra income, but it didn't take long for the returns department to start noticing an unusually high number of returns connected to her name. Her customers weren't upset, but the frequency of returns was raising flags. After some digging, the company's internal audit team traced the pattern of her activity to the specific sales tactics she had been using. One day, Jess was called into the office and confronted. She denied everything at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. She was fired on the spot for abusing the return policy to generate commissions. Not only did Jess lose her job, but the company implemented stricter rules for commissions and returns after the scandal. What Jess thought was a clever loophole to increase her pay backfired, leading to her career being cut short. Story 12. I was working as a project manager for a large software company when an employee in our customer service department, Ben, discovered a policy that seemed harmless at first but quickly turned into a huge mess. The company had a policy of offering free technical support for the first 30 days after a product was purchased. Ben realized that if he were to give customers who called in with a problem an extension of support for 60 days instead of 30, the company would pick up the tab and the customers would be happy. Ben started offering these extensions to nearly every customer who called in, even if their issue was something simple or unnecessary. By stretching out the support window, he managed to save customers money on the tech services they would normally have had to pay for after the initial 30 days. At first, no one noticed. In fact, Ben started to gain a reputation as the go-to guy for great service, and customers praised him online for his helpfulness. However, the company began to notice a growing issue. Support costs had spiked dramatically, and the profit margins for the product were shrinking. After a few months, the finance department realized that the extended support periods were eating into the company's bottom line. An investigation revealed that Ben had been offering support well beyond what was actually required by company policy, all without any approval. When confronted, Ben argued that he was only trying to help customers, but the company had no choice but to let him go for abusing the policy. Worse still, the extra support cost the company tens of thousands of dollars, and they had to implement new controls on customer support to prevent a recurrence. Ben thought he was being clever and customer-friendly, but it ended up costing him his job and the company a lot of money. Story 13. A few years ago, I was working in an office that had a fairly loose dress code, especially on Fridays. Casual Friday was a tradition, but our boss, Carla, decided to push the limits and introduce an impressively casual approach, allowing employees to dress however they wanted. The unspoken rule was that it still needed to look professional, but many took it as an opportunity to wear whatever they thought was stylish. One employee, Dan, took it a step further. He realized that the more casual the dress code became, the more he could push the boundaries by wearing outrageously unprofessional clothing. He showed up to the office in neon shorts, graphic t-shirts with offensive slogans, and flip-flops. At first, everyone laughed it off, thinking it was just a weird attempt at humor. However, when the behavior continued, it started to make people uncomfortable, and some of the clients began to ask questions about the new vibe at the office. Despite warnings from several co-workers, Dan doubled down, claiming that he was just being authentic. However, things came to a head when a high-profile client visited the office for a meeting. Dan showed up in a neon green tank top and sunglasses, trying to impress the client with his cool look. Needless to say, the client was less than impressed. They walked out of the meeting early, citing unprofessionalism as the reason. The incident led to a series of complaints from clients, and Carla was forced to issue a formal memo about appropriate office attire. In the end, Carla had to lay down the law, and Dan was reprimanded for disregarding the dress code. He thought he was making a statement, but his efforts only backfired. After several more clients complained about the unprofessional appearance of the office, Dan was ultimately let go for the negative impact his behavior had on the company's image. Story 14. A couple of years ago, I worked at a large public relations firm, and one of my colleagues, Lori, had a reputation for being a little too creative with her work. The firm often received large projects with tight deadlines, and Lori found a loophole in the way we billed clients. She noticed that if she submitted a project with additional hours that were actually never spent, she could bill the client for more than the agreed-upon amount. She wasn't being lazy. She was being overly ambitious in padding her hours, thinking that the clients wouldn't question the time claims. For a while, Lori was getting away with it. She convinced her clients that the extra hours were spent refining and fine-tuning the work. But the company's accounting department eventually noticed discrepancies between what was being billed and the actual work submitted. A routine review revealed that Lori had submitted inflated hours on multiple projects, essentially overcharging clients for work that never happened. When the firm confronted her, Lori tried to justify the hours by claiming that it was necessary to go above and beyond for clients. But the evidence was clear. She had been padding her billable hours to make herself appear more efficient and productive. Lori was immediately fired for overbilling, and the firm had to issue refunds to several clients. Not only did she lose her job, but the firm also had to revamp its billing practices to prevent further abuse. What Lori thought was a clever way to maximize her earnings led to her complete downfall, both professionally and financially. Story 15. A few years ago, I was working at a call center for a major telecommunications company. The company had a system in place to reward employees for excellent customer service, based on customer satisfaction surveys that followed each call. If an employee received a high satisfaction rating, they were eligible for bonuses and rewards. One of the employees, Tyler, realized that customers were often reluctant to fill out surveys, especially when they were satisfied with their service. He figured out a trick. After each call, he would ask customers to give him a perfect rating, and he would assure them that there was a special incentive for completing the survey. To make it sound even more convincing, he promised customers that their rewards would be processed faster if they completed the survey and gave him a 10 out of 10 rating. While the customers were mostly satisfied with their calls, many of them didn't feel compelled to fill out surveys on their own. Tyler, thinking he was outsmarting the system, started emailing his customers after calls with direct links to the survey, encouraging them to leave glowing feedback. He also manipulated his call scripts to ensure that he appeared helpful and knowledgeable enough to warrant a perfect score. Eventually, the company started noticing a pattern of unusually high ratings on Tyler's calls. When the customer satisfaction department conducted a deeper dive, they discovered the discrepancies and quickly realized that Tyler was directly influencing the survey results. Tyler was caught in the act, and the company terminated him immediately for manipulating the system. Worse, they had to redo the reward system to prevent further exploitation of the surveys. Tyler thought he could game the system, but it ultimately cost him both his job and any chance of a bonus. Story 16. I worked for a company that had a pretty lax policy on taking vacation time. Employees could accumulate paid time off, PTO, based on how many hours they worked, and they were allowed to take it whenever they felt like it, as long as their department could cover. It wasn't unusual for people to take last-minute vacations or random days off, but one employee, Aaron, found a way to manipulate the system. Aaron was incredibly savvy with spreadsheets, so he found a loophole in the PTO accrual system. It was common knowledge that the system calculated PTO based on hours worked, but it wasn't restricted by the day of the week. So, Aaron came up with a plan to rack up as many hours as possible to build a huge PTO bank. Every weekend, instead of working a typical 9 to 5, he'd come into the office for a few hours and log in, sometimes just to catch up on personal work, sometimes doing absolutely nothing, but always logging enough hours to accrue PTO. Over the course of months, he built up hundreds of hours of unused PTO. What Aaron didn't consider was the company's policy of use it or lose it. Once a year, employees were required to take a certain number of PTO days, or they'd lose them. Aaron, however, wasn't planning on taking vacation days in a normal way. Instead, he began using this accrued PTO to extend every weekend, taking several long weekends by simply cashing out the time. This worked well for a while, but it didn't take long for HR to notice that Aaron was consistently taking large chunks of time off without ever formally requesting vacation days. After a series of complaints from his colleagues about his unexplained absences, the HR department conducted a review of his hours. The audit revealed Aaron's manipulation of the system, and he was called in for a meeting. His strategy to maximize PTO turned out to be a huge mistake. He was reprimanded and eventually fired for abusing the policy. Not only did Aaron lose his job, but the company also had to adjust their PTO accrual system to avoid future exploitation. His attempt to game the system ended up backfiring in ways he hadn't imagined. Story 17. A few years ago, I worked as a marketing coordinator for a digital marketing agency. The company had a commission structure based on the number of client referrals we brought in. The policy was straight. If we brought in a new client who signed a contract, we received a percentage of the deal value. David, one of my colleagues, realized that the company had an odd loophole in its referral process. There was a grace period of 3 months after a new client signed a contract, during which time the referral commission could be modified or reversed based on how the client interacted with the agency. David figured that he could bring in a client, get the commission, and then after the 3-month period, he'd convince the client to pause their contract for business reasons, causing the contract to temporarily go inactive. This would then reverse the referral commission, allowing David to negotiate for a better payout by re-signing the client. For several months, David used this tactic and got away with it. The clients would be convinced to pause their contracts for various reasons. Sometimes they were reviewing their budget, or they had shifting priorities. David would then earn his commission, and once the client returned, he'd get another payout for the same deal. The extra commissions piled up quickly, and he seemed untouchable. However, the finance department began noticing some discrepancies. They saw that the same clients were entering and leaving contracts without any clear explanation. After a deeper investigation, it became clear that David had been playing the system to earn extra commissions by strategically pausing contracts. His actions violated both company policy and client trust, and the finance team uncovered that he was essentially double-dipping on the same clients. David was immediately terminated, and the company rolled out stricter guidelines on client referrals and commissions. What David thought was a smart way to maximize his earnings ultimately led to his downfall. His attempt to exploit the system left him without a job and a tarnished reputation. Story 18. A few years ago, I worked for a mid-sized tech firm. One of our senior developers, Tom, was a wizard with coding but also had an eye for finding shortcuts in company processes. The company's project management tool allowed employees to log tasks as completed, which could then be reviewed by managers to ensure proper tracking. Tom realized that he could speed up his workload by falsely marking tasks as completed before actually finishing them. For months, Tom would log tasks as done, when in reality they were only halfway completed, if not completely unfinished. He would then work on the tasks later, but not at the pace his managers expected. As the tasks were already marked as finished, he was able to fly under the radar. Tom found that by doing this, he could allocate more time to side projects he was working on, or just take extended breaks. His plan worked for a while, and he seemed to be excelling in the eyes of his managers. But eventually, the company started noticing a discrepancy between the progress on certain projects and the tasks logged as completed. The issue came to light when a crucial product update, marked as completed, was tested and found to be full of bugs. The project manager immediately asked for a review of the task logs, and it was soon discovered that Tom had been falsely marking tasks as complete to cover up the lack of real progress. Tom was fired on the spot, and the company overhauled its task tracking system to prevent similar abuses. His tactic to artificially boost his productivity ended up ruining his career at the company. It was a classic case of attempting to cheat the system that led to an embarrassing public exposure and a lost job. Story 19. When I first started working at a local coffee shop, I thought it would be a fun, low-stress job. But my coworker Hannah had other ideas. She discovered a loophole in the company's discount system. The company had a policy where employees could offer a 10% discount to any customer who asked. But the catch was that it was only for first-time customers. Hannah realized that many of the regulars had no problem pretending to be first-timers, and as long as she gave them the discount, they'd return again and again. This didn't raise any alarms until she started giving discounts to friends who came in often, even when they weren't technically first-time customers. After a while, Hannah got bolder. She began giving out the discount to friends and acquaintances, knowing that no one was really paying attention to how many times someone had visited the shop. She was pocketing the extra money that would have gone into the register if the discount hadn't been applied. It seemed harmless, at least until she offered a 50% discount to a new customer who came in for the first time. She was trying to make a good impression, but the large discount raised red flags with the manager. When the manager looked into it, he noticed patterns of excessive discounts being given out to the same group of people, many of whom weren't new customers. When confronted, Hannah tried to justify her actions by claiming she was simply being generous. But the company had no tolerance for that kind of behavior. She was terminated immediately, and the company had to revise its discount policy to limit employee discretion. Hannah's attempt to build a community through the discounts backfired, leaving her without a job and an ethical reputation in tatters. Story 20. In my previous job at a tech company, the management team had a habit of offering spot bonuses to employees who exceeded expectations on certain tasks. This was meant to reward exceptional work, but one employee, Jake, figured out a way to exploit the system. Jake was a great worker, but he realized that there was no clear definition of what qualified as exceptional work. The company wasn't strict about the criteria, and so Jake took advantage of the vague wording to earn spot bonuses for tasks that were far below his usual standards. Instead of doing his best work on projects, Jake started to prioritize simple, easily completed tasks. He would turn in work early, even if it wasn't up to his usual level, then immediately request a spot bonus, claiming that his quick turnaround was exceptional. He was taking credit for speed over quality, but since the company hadn't been very clear about expectations, his bosses didn't see the problem right away. For several months, Jake earned bonuses this way, but his approach began to irk his colleagues, who noticed that the quality of the work he submitted wasn't matching his bonus claims. Eventually, his supervisor began to review the work more closely. Upon discovering that Jake had been taking shortcuts and inflating his performance, they pulled him aside for a discussion. Despite his initial defense of his actions, Jake was fired for dishonesty. The company also had to change its spot bonus policy to ensure that only quality work could be rewarded. What Jake thought was a clever way to game the system ended up costing him his job. Story 21. A few years ago, I worked at a medium-sized company where our sales reps had a buy one, get one free promotion for a new product line. It was a great deal for customers, but our sales reps were given strict guidelines on how much they could discount the items, and the free item had to be of equal or lesser value than the first item purchased. One of our reps, Kelly, found a way to skirt the system. She figured out that if she rang up two items as separate purchases, she could give both items a discount, bypassing the rule that the second item had to be of equal value. Essentially, she'd sell a $100 item for $70 and a $50 item for $35, telling the customer they were still getting a buy one, get one deal. She'd pocket the extra commission on the sale, even though the promotion was supposed to prevent her from giving discounts beyond a certain threshold. For months, Kelly seemed to be thriving. Her sales numbers were through the roof, and she even got some praise from management for being a top performer. The only issue was that customers started coming back, noticing they were being overcharged and demanded price corrections. Word began spreading among regulars about the special deals they could get from Kelly. That's when the finance team got involved. They noticed the discrepancies in pricing for certain transactions and started an audit. They eventually found Kelly's manipulation of the promotion, and when they confronted her, she tried to argue that she was helping customers. Kelly was immediately let go for violating company policy. The company ended up instituting stricter controls for discounts and promotions, and sales reps were required to submit every discount for approval. Kelly's quick thinking may have helped her make extra money in the short term, but it ended up ruining her career and reputation in the long run. Story 22. At my previous job, I worked in an office where employees were allowed to use the company's cars for business-related travel. The company had a system in place to track mileage, and employees could submit mileage reimbursement requests for any business trips they took. The policy was generous. Employees were reimbursed at a rate per mile, regardless of whether they used the car for personal or work purposes. One of my coworkers, Ben, realized that the company's reimbursement system was not particularly detailed, and it didn't ask for specific documentation of where you were driving. So, Ben came up with a scheme to exploit the mileage reimbursement policy. He would take the company car for long drives around the city after work, clocking in miles as though they were for business-related meetings. Ben didn't actually attend any meetings, but instead took the car on unnecessary detours or long personal trips. For weeks, Ben submitted inflated mileage reports, pocketing a decent chunk of money every month. The best part? No one questioned the miles he was reporting because, technically, they could have been related to a business meeting that wasn't listed in the records. His schemes continued for months, and he was even given praise for being a very productive employee, because his supposed business trips were linked to high-revenue accounts. But eventually, the finance department caught on. One day, they asked Ben to provide more details on a specific business trip that was unusually long. They found out that the route he took didn't match up with the addresses of any of the meetings he'd reported. After further investigation, it was clear that Ben had been using company time and resources for personal gain. Ben was immediately fired, and the company had to rewrite its mileage reimbursement policy, ensuring that more detailed records were kept for each trip. He lost his job, and the company had to recover a significant amount of money due to his manipulation of the system. In the end, what Ben thought was a way to supplement his income ended up costing him far more. Story 23. At a previous job, I worked as a server at a high-end restaurant that prided itself on its exclusive menu with a wide range of rare wines and delicacies. One of the rules for servers was that we were required to recommend a wine pairing to customers when they ordered certain dishes, but we didn't have to sell the most expensive option. Sarah, One of my coworkers realized that the wine selection was an easy way to boost her earnings. She began recommending the most expensive wines on the menu, even if they didn't pair well with the customer's food. She would assure them that the rare wine was the best option, even if the dish they were eating would taste better with a less expensive choice. To make it even more deceptive, Sarah would offer to upgrade their wine to a superior vintage, without the customer realizing that the upgrade was actually a wine that cost hundreds of dollars more than what they originally ordered. At first, Sarah made a lot of money from her upselling tactics. Customers were often swayed by her confident attitude, and the tips she received skyrocketed. But eventually, customers began to notice that they were being sold wines they didn't really want or need. One evening, a couple who had ordered the most expensive wine Sarah recommended came back the next day, irate that they had been charged so much for a bottle that they didn't even enjoy. They confronted the manager, who was shocked by their complaint. The manager reviewed Sarah's sales and realized that she had been recommending high-cost wines to many customers, leading to a noticeable increase in returns and customer complaints. She was immediately fired for fraudulent upselling and manipulation of the customer experience. The restaurant also overhauled its wine pairing recommendations, making sure that servers could no longer push high-cost options without the customer's clear interest. Sarah thought she could boost her earnings by exploiting the system, but it ended up ruining her career and reputation in the industry. Story 24. I was employed as an administrative assistant at a law firm where the process for billing clients was pretty straightforward. Clients would receive invoices for services rendered, and those invoices had a clear breakdown of hours worked, along with the billable rates. The firm had an internal policy that allowed employees to add a small administrative fee for client-facing tasks such as filing paperwork or scheduling meetings. One of the junior paralegals, Lena, realized that this policy could be exploited. She began adding hours to her invoices for tasks that never occurred, small tasks like organizing files or reviewing documents that never took place. She would inflate the amount of time she worked on various cases and then add an administrative fee for these supposed tasks. Because the invoices were reviewed by higher-ups but not checked line by line, she got away with this for a while. However, as time passed, a few clients began to question their invoices, noting discrepancies between the work they saw being done and the charges listed. One particularly high-paying client flagged Lena's invoice, and the firm was forced to conduct a deeper audit of all recent billing. They discovered that Lena had been inflating her time for several months, adding hours and fees that didn't correspond with actual work. Lena was immediately terminated for dishonesty and fraud. The firm had to issue refunds to several clients, and they overhauled their billing system to include more detailed checks and balances. What Lena thought was an easy way to boost her income ultimately resulted in her job loss and the firm facing reputational damage. Her attempt to exploit a loophole in the billing system backfired spectacularly. Story 25. A few years ago, I worked at a marketing firm that frequently offered clients custom-made graphics and content for their websites and social media platforms. The company had a policy where freelancers could submit invoices for the hours they worked on projects, which would then be reviewed by the project manager and approved for payment. However, there was one flaw in the system. The company didn't require freelancers to submit timesheets or detailed records of the work they did. One freelancer, Oliver, realized that the lack of timesheet submissions meant that he could essentially bill for more time than he actually worked. He began submitting inflated invoices, reporting hours that were far greater than the actual time he spent on each project. For example, if he spent 2 hours designing a logo, he would invoice for 6 hours of work, claiming that the extra time was spent revising, even though he hadn't actually done any revisions. The company paid him without question for a few months because no one was closely monitoring the actual work hour. Things started to unravel when one of the project managers noticed a few inconsistencies between Oliver's invoices and the final deliverables. After some investigation, the company found out that Oliver had been padding his invoices for weeks, submitting exaggerated hours to increase his pay. When confronted, Oliver initially denied everything, but the proof was clear. He was overbilling for hours he didn't work. The company immediately terminated his contract and demanded a refund for the overpaid invoices. Worse, they implemented a strict timesheet system for all freelancers going forward, ensuring no one could exploit the system again. Oliver's attempt to inflate his earnings by manipulating the invoicing system cost him both his contract and his reputation. Story 26. A couple of years ago, I worked for a mid-sized nonprofit organization that often hosted large fundraising events. The events were supposed to help the organization raise money for various causes, but they had one major flaw. Ticket sales were handled by a third-party vendor. This vendor was responsible for tracking attendance, collecting payment, and providing event statistics. While they were reliable in many ways, there was one thing they didn't track: comped tickets, or free tickets that were given out for promotional purposes. One of our marketing coordinators, Tina, figured out that she could get around the company's policy by issuing comped tickets under the guise of promoting the event. She began giving free tickets to her friends and family, making it look like they were part of an official promotional strategy. Tina then went a step further. She would also issue comped tickets for herself and her close colleagues, claiming they were required for business development purposes. The problem was, Tina didn't report these tickets, nor did she follow up on the internal rules regarding their usage. Over time, the number of comped tickets skyrocketed, and when the final numbers came in, the nonprofit realized that they had effectively given away far more tickets than they had sold. The worst part, Tina had been getting credit for the full number of ticket sales, even though many of them were free. When management discovered what Tina was doing, they were furious. Not only had she been abusing the comped ticket policy, but she had also compromised the entire fundraising event's integrity. She was fired on the spot, and the nonprofit organization was forced to offer a public apology to its donors and funders. Tina's attempt to manipulate the system backfired, damaging her professional reputation and the nonprofit's financial stability. Story 27. A few years ago, I worked for a tech startup, and our customer service department was under constant pressure to maintain a high level of satisfaction. To keep morale up, the company implemented a rewards program that allowed employees to earn points for positive customer feedback. These points could then be redeemed for gift cards, time off, or other small rewards. While the idea was great in theory, it was poorly managed. The feedback system was open-ended, and it didn't require specific verification. One employee, Marcus, realized that he could manipulate the system by reaching out to customers directly after they had interacted with other team members. He would offer them a simple incentive, an extra discount or a small gift for their next purchase, in exchange for positive feedback on their interaction. Marcus would subtly steer the conversation toward how great the customer service had been, even if they hadn't actually dealt with him. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. He was just being helpful by making sure customers were satisfied, and the positive reviews started flooding in. He began racking up reward points and collecting gift cards, all while continuing to push for favorable feedback. However, his actions didn't go unnoticed. The HR department began reviewing the feedback trends and discovered that a disproportionate amount of positive reviews were being submitted about Marcus, especially from customers he didn't directly assist. After an internal investigation, it was clear that Marcus had been exploiting the reward system to benefit persons. Rather than firing him immediately, the company decided to take a different approach. They let Marcus continue receiving rewards for a while, only to announce that they would be auditing all feedback and tying future rewards to stricter criteria. When Marcus realized his points were being wiped out, he was caught off guard. His reward points were revoked, and he was warned about violating company policies. Marcus didn't get fired, but his attempt to game the system caused enough trouble for the company to put much tighter controls in place. His short-term gain ended up being a long-term lesson in the dangers of exploiting a flawed system.